situation as we found out. Like this one time we forgot to take a wrench, and then the only thing we had, and I had to use the wrench in a certain way such that the whole area was flat. So the only thing I could find was more than 10 inches apart, so that it became 14 inches or something, in which case your anchors would be far apart. Now what that means is there's a principle about the vector angles, how you use it. Your anchors, if you got them far apart, your angle should not be more than 60 degrees, ideally. Any more than that, it loads it more than 60% on each, which means that you're not efficiently loading it. For instance, this I would not say is an efficient anchor. This is 90 degrees, almost 85 degrees, let's say. What do you think?
I'd be sort of okay with it, but if it would be nicer if you could make it less.
Usually this gives you a 90 degree angle.
Yeah. So 80 degrees, I wouldn't be, I mean, like you said, depending on the circumstances, okay with it, but so we also discuss anchors in terms of how it is rated. This is probably about 60-70% there. If you take a hard fall on it, it will still hold, but ideal one is always 60 degrees or less. Now again, there is a principle in terms of if you're using cordlet style setup, it shouldn't be less than 30 degrees. Shouldn't be less than 30 degrees. Yeah. Because again, you lose that efficiency of the right vector angle.
One question there. So if your anchors are too close to each other, can the rock in between them rip apart? Like 30 degrees is incredibly small.
Yeah. So this is where what we use largely, we've been doing these days, helps, which is called equalite style of anchoring system. I would be okay with top rope anchors for this. Sorry?
When you need it, you have a sport anchor built up here.
Yeah.
On everything.
Awesome! Thank you so much. Okay, so this is what excites us, what excited us at some point, because when we realized what this can do. So I covered the vector angles. I hope I didn't cover it. I mean, I covered just pretty briefly. I said what's an optimal angle, right? You can't have it far apart. It should be less than 60 degrees ideally if you're in any kind of anchor setup. 30 degrees less would not be ideal for a cordlet setup. But here, this is an equalized setup. So any which way you move, it's still equalized. Whereas, I needed this.
Okay, so this is more based on limiters rather than a knot at the end. Is that the deal?
Yes. So this, if you notice, if you move around, it's loading only one side of the anchor. It's not redundant. I mean, it is redundant, but it's not equalized, right? Whereas you can move around with this, and it's equalized.
So the equalization comes from that X. The limiter just prevents it from.
So this now, this is another important concept. So if this is the equalization style, equalite style is what you're setting up. You're not going to clip in this way. What will happen?
Can rip off.
One of the anchor points fails.
Just come off.
It'll all come off. I mean, it'll come off much quicker under load.
You have that bite over there.
So you have the limiter knots. We'll get to the reason why we have the limiter knots. But this is a bloody important concept, the sliding X. So you put a twist on one end of one of the bites, on one of the loops, and clip in both. See this? So what happens here is, it fails, it won't come out. Let me show it to you with a regular 24-inch sling with no limiter knots.
I got it.
24-inch sling? Oh, I mean, even that's fine. Actually, I have. Thank you. So, let's say there are no limiter knots. Sometimes, for some of the slings, you will not. Still, you need to have the sliding nose, right? Now, let's see what happens here. It's not going anywhere.
The fall is large.
We will get to that. But if you flip in without the sliding X, okay. Now, one more quick thing that I want to cover, one more side note thing, is what's called a ADT, American Death Triangle. So you think this is an anchor right here? By itself? Okay, let's give you
Triangle.
No.
Not written.
The
Page.
this
One of them cuts.
right. It's not redundant. Now, is it redundant? Okay. By the way, this is called an American Death Triangle. We've actually seen pictures out of Sahyadris when people are using something like this. Do not ever use this. One of them fails, you're out. I mean, not only that. Sorry. What is happening here in this whole setup? Think
the
about it.
force along the carabiner is in the wrong, could be in the wrong direction.
Yeah,
But
so we talked about vector angles. Now think about it. One of the things about vector angles, I didn't take it to the logical conclusion is, let's say the vector angles, sorry, can I? So let's say this is where your anchor is. Or let's say here is the anchor. So there's equal amount of force on both sides, 100% each, when it's especially 180 degrees. So there's no redundancy as such. In fact, it is creating negative force on the anchor points at some point.
It's more load
If
than
you
it
do
is.
the
Yes,
tension
there's more load on
calculations,
each anchor point than
Then
the load that
there
you're
is
applying
no
at the very end.
The component on this
Yeah.
side has to match.
At 120 degrees, each anchor point gets the same load that's being applied to the end.
and at
If you go
100,
beyond 120 degrees, then each anchor point actually gets more load than you apply at this point over here.
You can actually snap it with one finger sometimes, apparently.
As you get close to 180 degrees, each anchor point gets almost infinitely more load than the amount of, it's like a huge load multiplier. Just pulling out here with a small load applies almost an infinitely larger load at each of those.
that gets used in machine design and as a way of creating a very large pull by a small load. You don't want to do the same thing accidentally.
Yeah, if you have any more physics questions, please guys. He's a professor in physics, right? Alright, so we talked about the vector angles and they just explained to you what the negative forces can be when you go beyond 120 degrees. Now what's happening here with the ADT?
This is at one.
so there is
Right, it's cross-loading also. So this is an ADT, so you will not use this. Is this acceptable?
that can come off.
Right. Just put a sliding
Sliding
edge. Right. So this is to help you understand the equalization part of it, the sliding X, and this is perfectly acceptable too. It's been used last 100 years plus in terms of anchor setups. Most of the times it's perfectly fine. But when you need that equalization, this is where it helps. And this is, but there's one small drawback to this. If one of these fails, there's a huge extension and shock loading. Right? That's where the limiter
Limiter
knots come
knot.
in.
And there's a second downside to that, which is if the sling itself fails, that's
it can
one
open
straight.
out.
Right.
because of the shock load.
Yeah.
Well, just if there
Even
was some
otherwise.
sort of sawing, right, and the strand itself broke,
Then
that
there's
would
one
all
failure.
just be one long thing that would pull out. If the same thing happened, if one strand broke here, you would still be in two there and here. So these are mirror image. If one of these strands broke, you would still be on the one in the middle.
That's the advantage of that other one, which is if it
Yeah.
breaks here.
Yeah. So this is again the limited knot. I mean, in this the no extension is. If it breaks here, you have a little bit of no extension, but it's not significantly as much as this. Here again, you have a little bit of extension, but it's not significantly as much as this, but a little more than a cordlet setup.
So how would you tie the limiter knots? Would you like
Overhand knots.
no? So I put the slings over the carabiners
Well-
and then do the sliding X.
Let's do it on the sport anchor.
Okay. Fine.
Yeah. So you have 1 point anchor here. Create one more anchor setup there. Can you, for these guys to practice? Oh, cool. So there are 3 out there. So 1 for each. So we covered the strong part of it, right? Let's go through it in terms of what do you think of what were the 4 things we covered just now, the principles behind anchors.
Strong stabilization.
Strong redundant, equalized, and
No extension.
And we showed you, and there are a few ways of doing it. So largely now the materials, right? What we use, the gear what we use for largely when we climb on the sport climbs. This is a 48-inch sling. Okay, 48-inch or 120 centimeters. You got 60 centimeters. Anyway.
60 purple.
So we carry a couple of these. One is for the anchor, the other is in case. It's just even if you carry one, if you know the route very well, that's adequate. This is 60 centimeters or 24 inches. Half of this. Okay. So you can, if you're using this. If you're using this for your anchor setup, sliding X is adequate, but if you think about it, putting limited knots on this might be okay. Let's see. But most of the time it's not recommended on a 60 centimeter, because if you notice what happens is it becomes too small. There's not much you can work. So what is recommended with the 60 centimeters as far as the AMG is concerned? If you're using it, you don't put a limited knot, but I need one.
1 second. Let me we'll give you one that's same length.
Slide
but
it,
different
nothing
color.
but twisting the thing and putting it inside it.
Give me that.
so you use 2 instead of.
Yeah. For top ropes, opposed,
Opposed.
redundant, no extension part of it. There is no limited knot as such, but you do not normally, in most circumstances, will not have a failure on both at the same time. I mean, even if one fails for whatever reason.
Do you,
Side.
just a question, do you worry at all about fabric on fabric friction
Yes,
in
I
that
was about to ask
situation?
that.
Not in this situation.
Okay.
Okay, this is okay. If you're using slings, I guess it's probably not prominent. But if you're using cordlets, will that happen? Do you use
Not in,
cordlets to do this?
not in this setup. In this setup, you will not have a friction of fabric on fabric.
If you were to use cordlets to make those things,
Yeah,
even then.
then fine. You can. Even then, I would not worry about friction. Where will the friction come in? Think about it.
Meaning, like yours. Yeah, so the ropes could still rub against each other.
Ropes will be here.
I mean, those two ropes.
To
The
generate the kind of heat required to burn through this, it has to be continuous friction.
like the example that was shared somewhere in a
Like
video.
pulling rope
Even
out
that
of
is
this.
pretty extreme. That's pretty extreme. That was really thin cordlet against big rope.
And even then you saw that it was like continuous movement. It has to be like really
This is
significant
just
movement
for
for them.
top rope, but this can also.
Top rope. I mean, even sometimes. See, the thing
If
is,
you don't have a thicker sling or longer sling,
longest line. Yeah.
then you would do this even on a sport.
Yes, this is what is AMG recommended, but most times what we do
What
Sometimes.
recommended? ANJ?
AMGA, American Mountain Guide Association recommended. That is what we're talking about is the most ideal way to do things. But sometimes, if you are very certain about your cordlet, how new it is, how strong it is. I mean, strong you can't really predict. But I would be okay with this sometimes.
With just one.
With just one. No limited knot in the small setup. See, the thing is this: all of us try to learn by the book, and then once you have experience behind you and know what the worst can happen, you might cut corners. But not until you learn what is the ideal way.
What about the beaners there? Do they have to be locking or does
If it's a sport anchor, no. But if it's a triad anchor, they need you need to throw in some lockers.
What do you mean? Some, like one locker and one.
Yeah. Also depends. If the other thing, okay. Now, depending on
One question.
where the rope, okay. The other thing that you will start thinking about is, let's say this is hanging on a rock, okay, and it's possible that your gate might open because the way it is, there's a knob there or something. Then you might want to lock it, or you might want to turn it around in this direction. So many things that you will think about.
Is there a difference in these beaners? Like,
Yeah, this is more of a rope to go in a
Quick
clip,
draw, yeah.
quick drop type setup. Bent gate, that's what it's called. This is straight gate.
you prefer the straight gate for ankles?
Yeah, straight gate for ankles.
You said like for trad anchors it's better to use the ones with the lock, and for sports anchors normal.
Okay,
with
so
the
here's
gate.
the thing. Again, I can think of multiple situations where I've used non-lockers.
Non-lock.
But again, it's a function of which side the gate is and so on. There are some times when I throw in a couple of lockers for comfort.
So why is there so much difference between a trad and a sport anchor? Like, what
Trad is more
very-
complex. We will talk about it briefly, but I think what you guys should at the moment learn
Is the
is
sport.
sport anchors. At least it creates the basis for your anchor setups. And we climb sport around here. But once you get into trad anchors,
Yeah, like 95%, more than 95% of the climbs around this area are sport climbs with bolted anchors. So.
and I would say you get into thinking about trad anchors when you have some amount of gear of your own. It doesn't really make sense for you to learn something that you're not going to use for at least a long time to come. And the moment you get your own gear, you'll start thinking about it. Okay. So just to recap, we discussed the 4 different principles that you have to think about: strong, redundant, equalize, no extension, timeliness, efficiency. Whatever anchor system you adopt, or these different systems of anchoring that you think of, practice to the point that you are freaking efficient about it. I mean, I think I'm efficient, but until I met Gokul, he's like, why are you fiddling on top? Because I took 1 minute more. Or Sunny, who once we got on top, I set up an anchor, he comes up, takes it apart and then resets it up in his own fashion, which he's so efficient about. Also, it's a function of what gear he had at that point. But so we climb around here largely, which is sunny, long days. We have light. We know what exactly the weather is going to be at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock. But it's still good to be efficient about things. Because even despite all these good weather conditions, Maggie and I have spent 22 hours on our climb. Which
20?
we went for 22 hours.
Oh wow.
Started at 10
Very
a.m. got
sufficient.
down 8 a.m. the next morning.
Many of the cracks
And you're
here.
climbing through the night?
We were doing things we shouldn't know about. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Many of the crags here have fairly short approaches, so when you're climbing somewhere that has a long approach, that's cutting hours out of your day. If it takes you 2 hours to walk in and 2 hours to walk out.
So long story short, we've got a little lazy about setting up our anchors time-wise, but it is freaking efficient. Important that you get efficient at those setups. What we are good at is throw us in any situation with whatever gear we have, we will know to set up our anchor. Now, what I've shown you is just with the slings, cordlet.
By the way, how many of you here know what fall factor is?
Fall factor.
Yeah. because the whole idea of Serene, keeping it strong and redundant, and the whole reason why we set up 2 points, expecting maybe 1 point will break, is all dependent on fall factor. Why would it break? Why would it break in the first place?
Fall factor is what, like a force applied when you're falling?
You know, right? So,
Yeah, so say you're climbing up. This is your anchor. Okay.
yeah, just a simple definition. Explanation will come.
Uh,
What is it? If somebody tells you fall factor, what do you think first?
So the number of anchors you're getting past, like
Okay,
No,
what?
in terms
can I
of
give a
meters
simple-
or like in terms of meters?
Can I give a non-science?
Yeah, that's okay.
So here's how I think about it, and I really don't want to think in terms of the science behind it. This is what I think about it. If I fall from this point, where I am, this is my anchor point, and I fall below it, it's fall factor 1. And it can generate quite significant forces. But fall factor 2 is if I fall exactly twice the distance from the anchor point, with no, all other things being equal, with no stretch, nothing, it creates fall factor 2, and it's certain to break something here. The gear, the anchor, or both of them. And certain depth.
Twice the distance of.
Twice the distance from the anchor.
Oh,
Between anchors.
So
between
it
anchor
falls
and.
twice the distance
Okay.
from this point.
See, basically fall factor is the distance you've fallen. It's basically a ratio. The distance you've fallen and the amount of rope or material available to absorb that fall.
Okay. Alright.
So if you think about it,
Basically, at how much distance that rope will get cut. That's the
Yeah, so if, like Swan said, if he's climbed to this point and he falls, the distance is fallen, let's say, is 3 feet. And that's the amount of material available to take your fall. Your fall factor is 1 because it's a ratio, 3 by 3. But if he falls from here, he's going to fall 6 feet.
But
the
there are
amount of
3
rope-
feet of rope between
Only
him and
3
the
feet
anchor.
of rope available to take that fall. That becomes a fall factor 2, 6 divided by 3.
Ah, right.
So the takeaway from this, importantly, is one, of course, all your anchoring setup and all that. But importantly, also is don't fool around your anchors. Load it. Some people think it's easier to get on the ledge and stand like this, let's say, because the ledge is here, or it's a little higher up. Here, it's still probably fine. But if it's at the same level as the anchors and I take a fall, it's dangerous for the anchors. I would rather load it. Load the anchors, right? Remain below the anchors. That's the idea.
So can you have more than fall factor 2? Meaning,
Yeah.
unless you rip a bolt or rip a quick draw somewhere.
Still no.
There is this possible to go beyond that.
How?
Like I
I
said,
think on a lead, right?
No, I mean,
Okay.
leave with the dynamic properties of the rope out,
Okay.
which absorbs the fall. But otherwise, it's not possible.
Okay.
Yeah, technically.
So that's why in the workshop last time you were telling not to get above the anchor
Exactly.
level.
Because then you'll have more than one factor
Because-
fall.
That's what he was saying.
So you're climbing
even
ends
if it
where
looks
the
like-
anchor is, right?
Even if it looks like you
Below
have better
the
place to
anchor.
stand,
You can just tap
but
the anchor.
that is introducing some slack in the anchor. Don't do that. Keep the anchor loaded because that's when it's safest.
So basically, if your anchor is, for example, somewhere set up around 3/4 of this length, that's where your climbing should ideally end, and that's when you have to come back. Otherwise, because if you're crossing the anchor, that means again you are.
Yeah,
And you fall on it,
So ideally, you should come down after that.
you
Once
should,
you reach the
you should stay under the anchor and keep it loaded. Ideally.
right.
or if you're leading beyond it, that's another thing.
Okay.
Like
Then you have
it's
to unclip and
Yeah,
lead.
it's a
or-
multi-pitch climb. That's a whole different thing.
Okay.
And sometimes, even when we are cleaning the anchors, sometimes we might have to go beyond the anchors. Your belayer should be conscious of it. What it means is you're leading beyond it now.
Right.
So, but if it's a top rope setup, there's only one anchor setup there,
True. True.
with redundancy, of course, and all other factors considered. But still, you have to think of it in terms of as if you're leading, and the fall factor there, however, is reduced because of the rope that's running through, the dynamism in the rope.
Right. And your belayer has to be conscious if you're crossing the anchor so that you don't get that fall.
It's a little more dynamic fall there because of the climbing rope.
By the way, sorry to, maybe it's out of context. So you have all this gear now to create the anchors. What if you do not have all this? You just have a rope.
You solo it out.
No, I mean
Okay.
you do
Rope
use
anchors.
ropes for.
Yeah, I was just coming to that. Now, the reason why I'm going to very briefly touch on it. Now, there are other factors too to consider with setting up of anchors, and that's what I had in the document. flexibility, racking and all that. Go through them in your own time and think about it when you revisit the document at some point. And that's not a comprehensive document anyways. By John Long's book. But the point is this, rope anchors are not very flexible. That's what we realized after a lot of experimentation.
Flexible meaning?
Like, what?
So rope anchor is basically you're not using cordlets or anything.
Like,
You just directly
You're setting
pass
up your
the
anchor
rope.
using the rope itself.
so for instance,
Glow which and you tie on the rope.
I'll probably create one more, and this is equalized.
Okay.
Right? This is one way of setting up, but I haven't used Indian. Sorry. Okay, let me set it up.